When you think of the worst subs in Splatoon, you probably think of something like the ink mine, which in itself doesn't really see a whole lot of use, but does have some capability to do something. But most people probably think of the toxic mist, which in reality doesn't really have a whole lot of applications. Ever since its release, the toxic mist has been sort of overlooked and ignored just because it doesn't really do a whole lot. And it seems like Nintendo thought it was going to be something really powerful, probably because near the end of Splatoon 1, the Disruptor, which is essentially the predecessor to the Toxic Mist, was pretty overpowered. So they went into Splatoon 2 thinking that the Toxic Mist was going to be pretty strong because at launch its cost was 70% of your tank, and it still has a 60% cost, and it has a lot of ink recovery lag. But what does make the Toxic Mist so bad, and is it really the worst sub in the game? So first, let's talk a bit about what the Toxic Mist does. When thrown, any enemy that goes through it has their movement speed decreased and their ink consumption increased, which sounds like it might be a good idea for something if you're trying to win a 1v1. However, in most cases, this thing is never actually used in fights, or that if it is used in fights, it makes very little difference, because a lot of weapons are still going to have a decent kill potential even with their ink consumption increase, and the movement speed, while a bit of a deterrent, isn't really going to make too big of a difference if both people are just staring each other down and fighting. So it doesn't really make it good for a 1v1 situation. So what does it really do well? And that's sort of the question here is, the Toxic Mist doesn't really do a whole lot well. It just sort of exists, and it's not really all that useful. It does have some applications, like in any sort of Rainmaker situation where the Rainmaker carrier needs to jump or go up a wall or something like that. The Toxic Mist does a great job, as the movement speed decrease also penalizes jumping and climbing. So if you put it at a spot where the Rainmaker has to jump, like on Shipyard Rainmaker, and the enemy tries to jump onto the elbow with the Rainmaker, if you throw a Toxic Mist, it's going to completely make it impossible for them to push that direction. This is a decent use of the Toxic Mist. However, for most people, this doesn't justify using it or any weapon that has it. The two big negatives that the Toxic Mist has is the fact that its ink recovery lag is really long, meaning that white part of your ink tank that you see after throwing one, that's a pretty long duration, and meaning that during that, you can't actually recover ink. That and the cost of the sub is really high, and it's only been decreased once since launch, and it went from 70 to 60, and 60 is still really high for this sort of sub that doesn't really even see any real benefit. So there's two big caveats to using this. You have a long ink recovery time and a heavy cost for something that doesn't really seem very effective in most situations. These two things are why you won't really see it very often, and why you'd see people saying that it's actually just a really bad sub. So what could be done about this? How could the Toxic Mist be turned into something that's actually useful? Well, for one, they really need to reduce its cost again. It definitely doesn't need to be at 60, maybe even 50's pushing it. Maybe 40% of your tank would be a good return for this sub. As for its effects, I don't really think that its effects need to be changed, but I do like the idea that was brought up by the Academy user creator, who suggested that a user that goes through the Toxic Mist sort of has a lingering effect, where after they leave the mist, they still have some of the effects of being inside it, though not as harsh, and then they slowly lose the effect as they get farther and farther away from the Toxic Mist. This is a sort of neat idea, as it sort of punishes people that are still just trying to like rush through it. Like, you see a Toxic Mist down, and you're like, screw it, I can go right through it. So they'll go through it and deal with the negatives that it has while it's inside the mist, but then when they go through it, they don't really care, it's back to normal. But in this case, it would still have some lingering effect for a little bit after you go out of it. I actually like this idea, and I suggested that maybe the duration at which the person is in the Toxic Mist directly correlates to how long this lingering effect lasts, and that you could tie it in as sort of like a poison effect, because it is a toxic mist. So the lingering effect could be considered like a poison effect. So now that we've talked about some of the changes it could see, let's talk about some of the applications you could already use it for. I mentioned earlier in the video about how you could use it to sort of stop Rainmaker pushes through spots that require jumps. And this is something that I feel could be more utilized, not only as a way to stop jumps, but stop certain spots like uninkable surfaces from being used as push spots for the Rainmaker or even in Clamblitz. Areas that are more common paths you could sort of stop with a Toxic Mist, with the general thought being that nobody really wants to go through it and have their movement speed be decreased in modes like Clamblitz and Rainmaker, where the objective is to just push and go as fast as possible. And in these modes, people tend to use a bunch of movement speed, so having that decreased could be a very vital thing. Another use for it could be to just completely stop entry points. When you're at a point like splat zones or tower control where you have a wipe going and you're trying to keep the enemy back in their base, or you're trying to watch certain angles, using a Toxic Mist to sort of block off a path to where the enemy would have to make themselves visible or known to go through, these sort of things can be used to deter certain paths from being used as entry points back into the map and out of the enemy spawn. The way I see it, this could be sort of utilized in the same vein as a smoke grenade in games like Counter-Strike, where when you use a smoke grenade, nobody really wants to push into a smoke grenade, so you could be used to close off paths. I could see the Toxic Mist sort of working in a similar fashion. Obviously, people are going to still walk through it and go through it, as it doesn't really provide too big of a deterrent, but it does give them a disadvantage when going through that path in the terms of like movement speed. And if they buff it to have a lingering effect, like what I mentioned earlier, then it could be more detrimental to actually just push through the Toxic Mist as opposed to just purely avoiding it. So with all that being said, is the Toxic Mist really the worst sub in the game? Yeah, it kinda is, but it does have some use that people aren't really tapping into, and this is definitely something I could see being more utilized if someone would to put in the time to figure out just how the utility could be used. There's also the argument that no good Toxic Mist weapon exists, and all the weapons that have it are just sort of outclassed by the other kit that same weapon has, but that also could come down to the fact that it just sort of needs buffs as well. So I think it is the worst sub, but it does have some potential if someone were to put in the work, or if Nintendo were to throw us a bone and make it actually usable. So what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think the Toxic Mist is the worst sub? Do you think that there might be some more utility to it? And what kind of buffs would you like to see to it? So with all that being said, I want to thank everyone for watching, and I will see you all next time.